Good evening, and welcome to the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series. We've made it to our 12th session, in which we will be finishing the biology module and talk about a topic that those of you who know me from before have already probably heard, because I find it very interesting and beautiful, and I love to talk about it. Natural selection and altruism. In previous sessions, we've discussed natural selection several times. We've explained the technical definition according to which natural selection is simply a difference in the reproduction of certain individuals caused by certain characteristics that are transmitted to the offspring and therefore increase or decrease in the population. We've also explained that although natural selection has been proposed as the natural mechanism responsible for biological diversity, in reality, it does not have the capacity to produce important changes in organisms, even with the help of a mutation. Today, we will continue to talk about natural selection, but focus on the implications this concept has for our perspective of the natural world. And speaking of natural world, what does this adjective natural suggest to you? Normally, when we talk about something natural, we mean something that is found in nature or that comes from it, and almost always we associate it with something good. We are advised to eat natural foods, lead a more natural lifestyle, and, as far as possible, use natural remedies for our health problems. Because natural is good. But is that always true? Can it be applied to natural selection? Is natural selection a good thing? We've already commented that there are people who think so. Charles Darwin, for example, in The Origin of Species, in which the main topic is precisely natural selection, ends the book by saying in the last paragraph that there is grandeur in this view of life. And he admires natural selection for its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to fixed law of gravity, for so simple a being, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. I've already told you that I personally do not believe that natural selection is responsible for the development of the beautiful and wonderful life forms on Earth. But even if it were, I wouldn't consider a good thing either. It's because for me, the end does not justify the means, and the means of natural selection are far from being good. Natural selection has been characterized with very famous phrases such as survival of the fittest, struggle for existence, and even the phrase in English, red in tooth and claw, which refers to the red of the blood and to fight tooth and nail. Natural selection is associated with competition, scarcity of resources, and the destruction of the weak. Natural selection is the reason why the smallest, weakest, or sickest zebra in the herd ends up becoming food. Natural selection in action can be represented with scenes like these of animals fighting fiercely for their territory or for control of the females. And in other cases, the fight is more subtle and uses tools such as beauty, but the objective is the same: reproduce more than others, pass on their genes to the next generation by all means, no matter what the cost. That is precisely the main idea of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. In this book, Dawkins describes a world governed by natural selection in which all organisms move by selfish motives, with the sole objective of having more children than others. Dawkins takes the reasoning to another level and proposes that not only are the organisms selfish, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and people, but also their genes. Those wonderful genes that we talked about in the last sessions would be nothing more than selfish fragments of DNA whose main purpose is to make lots of copies of themselves. And for that, they would have invented the human being and the rest of the organisms as vehicles or machines to make those copies. Everything that we are, not only physically, but also our behavior, would be motivated by that single purpose. The intention of our genes to make as many copies of themselves as possible. But that cannot be, because in nature we find altruistic behaviors. In many species, not only in the human species, there are behaviors that clearly do not benefit the individual who performs it, but to others. And that is altruism. Let's look at some examples. This species of bird is called the Florida scrub jay. When the young females of this species reach sexual maturity, they don't leave the family nest, but instead they stay with their parents, helping them to raise the following year's chicks. This seems clearly altruistic, because instead of leaving and sharing or starting their own family, these females give up having children of their own for a few years to ensure that their brothers and sisters get by. Another well-known example is that of vampire bats. As their name indicates, these bats feed on mammalian blood, but they have a problem, and that is that their energy consumption is so high that if they go 2 days without eating, they die. Scientists have discovered an altruistic behavior in vampire bat colonies that consists of sharing food. If a bat has not found someone to bite and returns to the colony with an empty stomach, other, more fortunate bats may share some of their food by regurgitating it into the hungry companion's mouth. I know this is a bit unpleasant, but it's what happens, so that's why I tell you. Scientists who have studied these colonies have seen that this help not only occurs among relatives, but also among unrelated bats. An obvious example of altruism. No? Or not? Let's see how Richard Dawkins explains this type of behavior. Do you remember when we said that in The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins affirmed that design in nature is only an appearance of design that confuses us? Well, in this book, he uses the same argument again. For him, altruism in nature is not real, but only disguised selfishness with the appearance of altruism. Dawkins explains the case of the birds as follows. In reality, the female who gives up forming her own family doesn't do so out of altruism, but because the end result of helping her brothers and sisters is similar to having her own children, because the siblings share the same genes. Furthermore, an inexperienced young female risks not knowing how to properly care for her chicks and having them die after a lot of effort has been put into them. So these females are actually selfish. Not only do they manage to multiply their genes, they also learn to be good mothers for when they finally decide to leave the nest. What about bats that help other unrelated bats? In this case, the explanation is that they are forming alliances to protect themselves in the future. A bat that feeds a companion does not do so out of altruism, but to make sure that the day that it doesn't find food, that the companion will help it in return. According to Richard Dawkins, true altruism doesn't even exist in the human being. When we see people who dedicate their time, money, and effort to help others, or who even give their lives, in reality, there is some hidden selfish motive, such as the dispersion of our ideas in society that in this case would replace the copies of genes. Personally, I think it must be sad to see the world in this way. To look around and see nothing but struggle, selfishness, and people, animals, and plants trying to trample each other. Fortunately, not all scientists have the same perspective, not even among evolutionary scientists. It's a question of worldview, both in nature and in life, in other people, and even in the Bible. Many times we find what we are looking for. And when one wears the glasses of natural selection, it's likely that one only sees selfishness everywhere. But as I was saying, that is not the case for the entire scientific community. What's more, there are some scientists who have a completely different perspective, and I would like to tell you about two of them. The first is SUZANNE SIMARD, who is a botanist. Although botanists normally study the plant kingdom, plants in general, SUZANNE SIMARD is dedicated to studying fungi and how fungi are related to plants. I'm going to briefly tell you about one of her investigations, but if you are interested in knowing more details, I recommend this TED Talk in which she explains it herself and in which is titled How Trees Talk to Each Other. As I was saying, SUZANNE studies fungi. When we hear the word fungus, we usually think of mushrooms. But mushrooms are just a very small part of fungi. It's a reproductive system that's found outside of the soil to spread spores. But most of the body of the fungus is made up of very long filaments that extend through the interior of the soil. All the filaments together are called mycelium. When SUZANNE SIMARD was studying the mycelium of a forest floor, she realized that the filaments of fungus connected the roots of the trees together, as you can see here in this picture. And it occurred to her that perhaps the trees could be using those filaments like internet to communicate with each other. To check if her hypothesis was correct, SUZANNE did what we scientists do: design an experiment. She grew some trees on the forest floor, and when they had grown a little, she covered them with plastic to keep each of their environments independent from the others and control what they took from the air. We've already explained that plants grow and eat using water, air, and solar energy with the process we call photosynthesis. What they take from the air is carbon dioxide, and they use the carbon in that molecule to make the complex organic molecules with which the plant is built. In this experiment, one of the saplings was covered with a black cloth so that it couldn't access sunlight and therefore could not photosynthesize. The other plants, which were covered in clear plastic and could photosynthesize, were given they were injected with special radioactively labeled carbon dioxide that can be detected with a radioactive counter. Different saplings were given differently labeled carbon dioxide. And in this image, we've represented it with two colors, yellow and red. And after some time, all the plants, including the one that was covered in black, were sampled and analyzed. The result was very exciting because the plant that had been covered in black was found to contain radioactive carbon. As all the plants were isolated from each other in their aerial part, the conclusion of the study was that the plants that could photosynthesize had sent food, the organic molecules, to the covered plant by means of the fungus filaments that joined their roots. We can imagine the exchange of messages on the forest internet as something like this. The covered plant sends a distress signal. I don't know what's going on. I can't see the sun and I'm hungry. And the other plants respond to it by sending it sugars that each one has made with the carbon dioxide that they had at their disposal. Isn't that incredible? Trees not only communicate with each other, but they help each other, and some of the trees in the experiment weren't even of the same species. The second researcher that I want to present to you is the Dutch ethologist Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal studies social animals that live in groups, especially primates. He's written several books, and one of the ones that I like the most is entitled The Age of Empathy. In this book, Frans de Waal explains that in most cases, the social life of animals is not characterized by continuous struggle, but quite the opposite. Animals that live in groups collaborate with each other, they avoid confrontations, and often show empathy and even altruistic behaviors. There's a quote in this book that I find very curious, and that corresponds almost exactly to what we were saying a while ago about the worldview. It says, "The book of nature is like the Bible. Everyone reads into them what they want, from tolerance to intolerance, and from altruism to greed." I don't know if Frans de Waal is a believer, but he certainly is an evolutionist. And yet, he looks at animals with different glasses from the ones that Richard Dawkins wears and sees things very differently. Many of his experiments and observations have been made with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are highly intelligent animals, and they have quite a temperament. So in chimpanzee societies, it's easy for disagreements and conflicts to arise. The interesting thing is what happens at that moment. When a chimpanzee is upset, the rest of the group doesn't encourage a fight, but rather a resolution of conflicts in a peaceful way. To achieve this, chimpanzees use the same gestures that humans use: kisses, hugs, and something so universal like reaching out their hand. I would like to share with you some of the experiments that Frans de Waal and other research teams have carried out to study the social behaviors of chimpanzees. In the first one, they tried to find out if the chimpanzees are willing to collaborate for a common goal. In this long tray that you see, it contains food. And the researcher is putting a long cord or rope along the whole thing. And so it reaches across the whole part of the tray, and the chimpanzee realizes that right away that if it pulls on one side of the rope, we'll see it here in the video. We see here that he just now realized that by himself he's not going to be able to reach the food. So he decides to open the door of a companion, and between the two of them and the effort together, collaborating together, they manage to get or reach the food. What happens when a chimpanzee needs help and there's no other chimpanzee around? Let's watch another thing here. In this case, there's a young chimpanzee that's not very strong that knows that underneath the rock, that heavy rock that you see there, there's food that's been hidden underneath. We see him trying to pull the rock up, but when he realizes that he can't do it alone, he goes and looks for help of whoever's close by, which in this case is a human being. And between the two of them, together, they are able to get to the food. It's clear to us now that chimpanzees collaborate with each other and with other species to get food, but that's not altruism, which is true. What happens in the opposite situation? What if a human needs help and a chimpanzee is nearby? Let's watch. The experiment that you're going to see now has also been done with young children, and the result is the same. The kids were less than 2 years old. It consists of the researcher dropping an object and pretending that they want to reach it but can't. Let's see what the chimpanzee does. You can see how the researcher let something fall, and the chimpanzee spontaneously drops down, picks it up, and then takes it back to the person who dropped it. You see that they do it multiple times, and the result is always the same. The chimpanzee picks the object up and takes it back to the person who dropped it. The children did the same thing. It's instinctive. In the earlier book, The Age of Empathy, Frans de Waal says the following, referring to both humans and chimpanzees. We are programmed to connect. It's curious that an evolutionist says that we're programmed. I know that he doesn't mean that, but for me, the existence of a program suggests a programmer. The last experiment I'm going to show you is a bit more sophisticated. It was designed to find out if chimpanzees consciously decide to help others if they have the opportunity to do so or not. 2 chimpanzees were placed in adjoining facilities, separated by a fence so that they could see each other and hear each other, but not touch each other. One of the chimpanzees was trained to give an object to the researcher in exchange for food, but could choose between 2 objects of different colors. Let's watch it. If the chimpanzee turned in or handed over the red, which is the selfish decision, like we're going to see here in this first case, the chimpanzee that turned in the object received the food, but the one that was next to him didn't. But if it handed the green object over, the pro-social or altruistic decision, in this case, food was given to both the chimpanzees, the one that turned over the object, as well as the one that was next to him in the other facility. The results of the experiment have been represented in a graph that we are going to see now. The horizontal line marks the 50%. So if the chimpanzees were choosing red or green at random, the results should be around that middle line. But if you look closely, in most cases, the result is above the line. Each of these columns corresponds to a different part of the experiment. The first is the case where the chimpanzee in the facility next door was inactive. It's quite above the middle line, and which means that the chimpanzees tend to pick the green object, which they're wanting to feed their neighbor as well. The second column is where the companion had realized what was happening and was drawing attention and asking for food. And so they're very intelligent, and they realized. And so the line goes up even farther in that column because the chimpanzee realized that he needed to feed both of them. And in the third, it represents the cases in which the companion or the next door neighbor chimpanzee became aggressive. And we see that it's still above the red line, but it lowers down because the other chimpanzee became aggressive. And so the one with the object creates kind of a punishment. But in all three cases, the answer is a majority of the green. The last column is very important because it's the control experiment. These are the cases in which there is no companion or next door chimpanzee, and it shows that the chimpanzees know exactly what they're doing. When there is no companion, they mostly give the red one because they know that there is no one else that they need to feed. To me, all the experiments and observations of cooperation, empathy, and altruism in nature are evidence of what the world was like in the beginning and how it should be. Clues to the original creation that have not yet been erased, even after thousands of years of sin. If we read the Bible starting at the beginning, we realize that in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, there is no natural selection. There's no shortage of resources, there's no struggle for existence, there's no predation, and there's no death. Animals and people feed on plants, and the plants feed on water, air, and sun. The different organisms collaborate with each other and help each other in many ways. The Bible doesn't mention photosynthesis, but we can assume that God invented it and put it in plants, just like the process of breathing that He put in animals and other organisms. Breathing and photosynthesis are complementary processes so that the waste, the gas, produced by the plants is the gas that the animals need to breathe and vice versa. We've said that the plants feed animals, but the system is designed in such a way that by eating, animals help plants by reproducing and transporting pollen and seeds. I could continue giving you hundreds of examples of symbiosis in nature, and I only know those that have survived up to this day. But I'm sure that there were many more in the Garden of Eden. I like to call this original system the circle of love, of collaboration, of altruism, in which all organisms care about each other, and therefore everything works and nobody suffers. But if we read on, as soon as we get to chapter 3, we recognize the exact moment when natural selection entered our planet. When Adam and Eve decided to eat the forbidden fruit, they also decided to stop depending on God and take over. Until that moment, God had been the provider of all their needs, but then they decided that He didn't deserve their trust, that He was hiding something important from them, and they decided to find out what it was at any cost. In the following verses, we see how natural selection, with all that it entails, takes hold of them. The circle of love and altruism is broken and changed to figure it out for yourself, or every man for himself. Distrust, fear, and guilt appear, which makes them hide, defend themselves, which makes them attack each other and attack God. It's not my fault. It's that woman you gave me. It wasn't me. It was the snake that you created. And selfishness appears and soon after spreads to the rest of nature. Animals become selfish and start eating each other. Plants generate thorns to defend themselves. Some even become carnivorous. And after a few generations, the earth is so full of violence that God has to destroy it and start over. But in this new beginning, natural selection is already present and is still present today. We Christians love to find evidence of God's love in nature. But we have to recognize that competition and selfishness also abound. What should our attitude be towards this reality? Should we adapt, accept the natural selection has a prominent role in our world and that we have to survive and play its cards? Some even think that natural selection was invented by God and that deep down it's a good thing. But the Bible doesn't support this idea. When Jesus came to this world in person to show us what God is like and what he expects us to be like, he had a completely anti-natural selection attitude. On multiple occasions, he gave scientific or specific instructions that oppose natural selection, such as love your enemies, bless those who curse you, pray for those who prosecute you, turn the other cheek. If someone wants to take advantage of you, give them even more of what they've asked for. That's so hard. It doesn't come naturally to us, and it doesn't seem to make sense either. But Jesus doesn't only affirm it with his words alone. Jesus' actions throughout his life place him at the opposite extreme of natural selection. When the soldiers come to capture Jesus in the middle of the night, Peter, who is very pro-natural selection, takes out his sword and cuts the ear off one of the soldiers. But Jesus rebukes him because that is not his way of doing things. Jesus heals and forgives. Jesus humbles himself and endures the most terrible torture and even death at the hands of his enemies, having all the power in his hands to be able to change that. That's the kind of God that I believe in. The God of the weak, the sick, the children, the poor, the defenseless, all the unfit who would be exterminated by natural selection. And for that, I can't imagine him using natural selection, fighting and death to create or to achieve his goals. I know that some of you don't agree with me because you've written to me and you've told me so. It's fine. Some of you think that predation and death in the animal world are not a problem for the character of God, but I, as a specialist in animal behavior, cannot share that idea. I've had the privilege of working closely with chimpanzees, and I assure you that these animals have a very rich emotional life, and they suffer intensely. I'm sure that those of you who have dogs or cats or any other kind of animal at home, you know that too. I'm going to anticipate a question or comment that will probably already be on the list, or at least in the head of someone's head. Is there an evolutionary explanation for altruism? Yes, there is. In fact, there is a whole field of biology, sociobiology, that tries to explain the social behavior of organisms, including apparently altruistic behaviors, from a materialistic point of view. The explanation is similar to that proposed by Richard Dawkins. Collaborating is advantageous. Perhaps not for the individual, but for the group, yes. Groups that fight all the time perform worse than those that collaborate, and therefore, natural selection favors groups that collaborate. I'm going to include more information on these theories in the additional materials. They have some interesting ideas, but also they have some problems. Personally, the biblical story seems more coherent to me. God created a good world without suffering, without death, without natural selection. All these things appeared later because of human disobedience, and all of creation has ended up paying for it. But we still find numerous clues in nature of how things were originally. Best of all, the Bible assures us that the curse of natural selection will not last forever. God is preparing a return to the original plan, and we know that on the new earth, there will be no natural selection. Predators and prey will once again live in peace, and we will finally and forever enjoy a truly natural nature, the one that God had planned for us from the beginning. Because what is really natural, from God's point of view, is the empathy, love, and altruism that God programmed into our genes and into our brains. So well that even evolutionary scientists recognize that programming even if they don't recognize the programmer. But we do know who our Creator is and what He is like, and I think that the hope of seeing Him very soon and enjoying with Him the true natural nature in all its splendor is a precious way to finish our biology module. Next week, we will begin the last module in the Faith and Science Fundamental series with the topic Geology and the Flood.